Hello and welcome to Gloria's Tribe. All right, I have to give you a little introduction on my next guest. This gentleman, he's quite the accomplished fellow. He is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University, Illinois, in the States. And here he is talking to little old me. I had the great pleasure to have a little chat with this gentleman, and he's quite an accomplished man. He is also the director of the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship over there as well, and a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. You can find them on YouTube. They've got all sorts of interesting videos talking about topical news or discussions, deep discussions, basically. And so he's written, author of 5 books. I think he was part of a documentary of one of his books, Nietzsche and the Nazis. That was 2010, I believe. And the reason I got in touch was about this book right here, Explaining Postmodernism. See that? Yeah, it's an incredible piece of work. It's very controversial, and it was released in 2004, then expanded again 2011. And I got in touch with Dr. Hicks about this book because it's an incredible piece of work. It's a very easy read, by the way. Have a look at it. Have a look at it if you're interested. It gives you quite an intellectual history from the Enlightenment period, 500 years ago, all the way up until now, and highlights a few incredible philosophers and major thinkers along the way that have been instrumental in creating this philosophy, this school of thought of postmodernism. And it's a very slippery thing to put your finger on. Yeah, it's in my cultural politics series. So this next episode will be with Dr. Hicks. We're going to have a quick little chat about postmodernism, what it is, and how it influences, as it is a big driving force, which I believe in a lot of the political beliefs and the chats that we hear today going on. I think a lot of it's driven by this postmodern thinking. Even though certain people are inhabited by these thoughts, they're not quite familiar with postmodernism itself. It's quite a complex topic, but yeah, we had a lovely chat, and I stole a bit of his time. He's a lovely gentleman, so I hope you enjoy it. And if anything gives you a little brief insight to postmodernism and helps you understand the political debates and chats that's going on today in our society and in the news. All right, hope you enjoy. Okay, here we are. Dr. Hicks, thank you so much for joining me. I very much appreciate your time.
Oh, a pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yes, I've been a big fan following your work, and I've watched some of your discussions, and your book, Explaining Postmodernism, was a great inspiration of my own personal philosophical investigations. So that enlightened me a ton. So I'm very happy to speak with you today.
All right. Well, that's all flattering to hear. So thanks.
Okay. And as we discussed, I have already done the intro. So we'll just jump straight into some questions that I would love to discuss with you and find out a little more and learn from the man himself. Okay. So the first question that I had, which would be, I guess, quite a complex one, but in a brief manner, is it, I guess, if you could give me an idea about what postmodernism is and how it relates to Marxism.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice big question to start with, isn't it?
Of course.
Right. Yeah. So, intellectuals, philosophers, historians, people who think about the big picture questions, for those terms, we are trying to understand all of the major issues that human beings put to themselves and then put them in a historical framing as well. So what people have believed, or at least predominantly, has changed over the course of centuries and in many cases eras. So we do have this concept of the modern world. And so the modern world, so the most important distinction is going to be seeing the postmoderns as saying, this is what the modern world has all been about, and we need to go beyond that, right? Or they're going to say, we think the modern world has been a failure, that it's reached its end, and we are beyond that. So the most important thing is then to start with seeing what the postmoderns are rejecting. And that means what do we mean by modernity?
Mm.
Now, calling something a modern is used variably, we know, in different disciplines and in casual life as well. But the way philosophers and historians, and that's the framework that I'm coming from, use it is essentially to talk about the last 500 years of human history, when it has been really revolutionary times. So, we go back to Columbus crossing the ocean. That's a game changer for the world. We have artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael transforming the visual arts, and that's a game changer for the art world. We have Martin Luther in the early 1500s with his religious revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and that's a game changer for how we do religion in the modern world. So the idea is that modernity came into existence about 500 years ago, and that's the era that we've been living in. Now, what philosophers like to focus on is the intellectual revolutions that were occurring at that time. So when we start thinking about philosophers, we call them the early modern philosophers, like René Descartes, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and the others. What's going on there is an elevation of the individual and his capacity for reasoning. And this is a game changer philosophically, because the idea here is that each individual needs to think for himself and then increasingly herself. And the contrast is to earlier pre-modern ways of thinking that would appeal to various kinds of authority. So there's the authority of scripture, or there's the authority of the church, or there's the authority of various other texts, maybe from the Greeks and the Romans that have come down to us. And who am I to question the authority of those texts or those institutions, right? Or the idea that somehow all of the important truths have already been discovered in ancient times, and my job is to accept them and pass them on. So what's new in the modern world is the idea that individuals can think for themselves, they can discover the world, they can challenge authority, and that there's a huge amount of new stuff to be discovered and worked out. So new ways of doing art, new understandings of global economies, new ways of doing science, new ways of thinking, and a new emphasis on the importance of the individual. So those themes, valorizing science, valorizing the individual, valorizing the idea that we can discover new knowledge and improve the world in our lives as a result of doing so. Those are the sorts of things that are characteristically modern, right? Instead of saying it's all been worked out, we the authorities have the truth, you should know your place in society down there, and you should obey and do what we tell you to do. Sure. So as these modern themes develop, then we start to talk about the enlightenment of the 1700s. So then all individuals should be free in all areas of their life, religiously, politically, economically. Slavery seems to be a moral abomination now because it's not respecting individuality and leaving people free. Second-class status of women all seems to be ridiculous, and so we should make sure that women are equally free because they're also rational and can do science and everything as well. So the point of all of that is that that's the modern world that most of us are familiar with, but the postmoderns are arguing, and they're arguing deeply, that all of that is false, and or all of that is in bad faith, right? And or all of that has been a failure. So this idea that somehow science can figure out objective truths about the world. Well, they don't believe in objectivity. They think they come to buy into various arguments that are very skeptical about our possibility for acquiring knowledge. The idea that individuals have agency and can control their own lives, that's also been subject to a lot of skeptical attack. And they typically, the postmoderns don't really believe in individuals. They'll typically see, you really are just a vehicle for various group forces. You are structured by your class identity or your racial identity or your ethnic identity and so forth. So what they will then do is just, and this has been over the course of several generations, the lead up to this, that by the time we get to the famous postmodernists, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Lyotard, and Rorty and the others, is a rejection fundamentally of all of the important claims of the moderns. So that's the postmoderns versus modernity.
Okay.
Now the other part, I'll pause right there because that's already a big chunk of material in case you want to jump in, and then we can save the Marxism stuff for the next step.
Yeah, sure. So there was a big elevation of the trust from a centralized power, whether it's a religious structure or whatever it may be in the medieval times, to trust in the individual. So it's a big exchange of trust for the Enlightenment to carry on, and individuals go about doing their thing. And what we have now in our Western society today is the product of that exchange of trust, basically. Yeah.
That's right. So, you can be friends with whomever you want. It doesn't matter if they're in the right class, so to speak. You can choose whatever career you want. It's not decided for you. You can marry or not marry whomever you want. You can believe anything you want religiously. You can participate in the political process and put any ideas you want or not. So we're very individualistic, as you're saying.
And what about, is there like a list of claims that they have laid out as how they govern this philosophical school of thought? Is there a number of claims that they have attached to them?
Well, yeah, the claims, I structure things as a philosopher. We think philosophers ask essentially 5 questions. What's the nature of reality? What is it to be a human being? How should I live my life as an individual? How should we organize ourselves socially? And then for all of those big questions, how do we know the answer to any of those questions? Now, the labels that we put on them are to say those are metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, right? Questions about human nature, question about ethics and values, political philosophy, and then cognitive issues or epistemological issues. So the moderns are by and large naturalistic in their metaphysics. They believe in the individual and individual agency in their understanding of human nature. They believe in the pursuit of happiness, morally speaking and ethically speaking, and in strong self-responsibility. And then typically they believe in equal liberty rights politically. And how do we know all of these things? Well, by using our senses, acquiring experience, and reasoning about it. So those would be a short list of modernist claims.
Sure. Okay. And so how are they, what is their attack on reason? Like the individual has its capacity for reason. How is that attacked by the postmoderns exactly?
Well, by the time we get to the postmoderns, there's been several centuries of very sophisticated philosophical attack. I mean, philosophers are always arguing about everything. Sure. And so if you think about our cognitive capacities, we're an extraordinarily complicated psychological being, right? So we've got our 5 senses, and somehow they're organized into perceptions of objects, and we have memory systems, and then we form abstract concepts, and we put them together into sentences and propositions. Sure. And then we start structuring all of those in narratives and developing scientific theories, and then developing mathematics, and then logical methods and statistical methods for evaluating theories and so on. So if we're going to work out a full theory of how human cognition works, then we have to say something about sensation, about perception, about memory, about concept formation, about propositions, about theory formation, about narratives, and then mathematics and logic. And already I'm just up to 8 things.
Sure.
Right? Okay, so what each of those is complicated, but there can also be skeptical arguments made about each of them. So suppose we say, for example, that the scientific method is based on observation. And even if I come up with some sophisticated hypothesis, ultimately I need to put that to the experimental test. And that experimental test is going to look at what is going on in this beaker of chemicals, right? Or look at this thermometer, right? Or whatever. So that's to say you're going to test it against observation, and that's going to be your bottom line piece of data. But then you can say, well, observation, we are subject to illusions sometimes, right? So our senses might trick us or deceive us, or maybe our senses seem to be relativized. So how something tastes when you're well tastes different from how it tastes when you're sick, right? Or sometimes if you're on drugs, you start to see things that aren't even there. So maybe our sensory capacities aren't that reliable or not very trustworthy, or they're very subjective. And so you've got various skeptical attacks on the senses. And to the extent that you think those are unanswerable, then you're going to say, well, if all of reason and scientific method is based on the observation of the senses, but that's unreliable, then everything is unreliable. And that would be one sort of attack. But what we find over the course of the last several hundred years is going to go back and forth, and there are answers to all of those skeptical arguments. But the postmoderns come of age in an era when philosophy collectively had reached a pretty skeptical place about logic and mathematics and concepts and the whole set of cognitive apparatus.
Right. Okay. So it's interesting. I mean, if we're beings with a subjective interpretation of the world, we've got 5 data channels for our senses, and we can mess up our interpretations, for example, through maybe our own pain or other drives, our trauma, whatever experiences that may impact on our interpretive ability. It would seem that the subjective interpretations are what's in question. Like, because if you say, for example, you want something, you got a value, therefore you go ahead and you use your mind, your capacity for reason to operate on the world, create some tool to operate on the world with this scientific method, for example. Mm-hmm. What would be in question, it just seems to me, is the subjective interpretation, not the tool itself. Or if many other people can repeat that test, it seems like the tool is functions, but in order to generate a tool to work on the world, it needs to be the subjective interpretation needs to be, like, I guess, clear or validated by others to some degree. Does that?
Yeah, that territory you're sketching, it's important territory. My sense is that we might be using subjective in 2 senses, and they're both legitimate senses. One sense just is to say, the subject, I or you, right, is involved in the cognitive process. So there's a reality out there, an objective reality, and I, the subject, am active and doing various things to try to come to know the objective reality. And so what's going on in the subject then is distinct from what's going on out there in reality, and then we have that question, and that's kind of a metaphysical use of subject and object, just to distinguish what's out there from me or from you as the agent. But there's also an epistemological sense of subjectivity, right, contrasted to objectivity, where we say you are being objective if you, the subject, are using your cognitive capacities in such a way as to try to keep the contents of your mind in connection with external reality, and you are being subjective by contrast if you're not trying to do that. So subjects can be objective, or subjects can be subjective. So if for example, I don't know, suppose there's some woman I've just met, and I'm infatuated with this woman, and so I'm all emotional, right, about this woman, but you have independent knowledge about this woman, right? You know that she's really bad in some ways, and you're my friend, and you come and talk to me, and you say, Stephen, I have some information about this woman, and you might not like what you're going to hear. So if at that point, if I just, I let my emotions say, no, I really want to be infatuated with her, so I'm going to block out any information from you, then I, the subject, am acting subjectively.
Sure. Yeah.
By contrast, if I then were to say, okay, I know I'm having certain emotional reactions to her, and sometimes those can make me feel biased, and I've got some information about her, but Christian also has some information about her. Maybe I should pay attention to this information. Then I'm being objective.
Okay, right. So my previous little question's a little convoluted. Let me just clarify that, because these things twist your mind up a little bit sometimes. And I'm sure you've been down that rabbit hole plenty. But I guess my point would be that, like, if reason is in question because it's only operating on a foundation of subjective interpretations that's unstable or untrustworthy, unreliable. So reason's out the window because it's standing on
that's the thing that's being argued about, right? Is the subject's cognitive capacities, are they reliable or unreliable?
Sure. Yeah. And I guess the postmodern claim is that all of reason is unreliable.
Yes, that's right.
So that's my point would be, if all of reason is unreliable, then all of subjective interpretations are unreliable. Like, they're in the same boat of unreliability. So therefore, nothing is to be trusted at all, ever.
That's right.
So
that's right. And
so this is where
we're in the position of saying, if nothing is to be trusted and everything is unreliable, then why should we even be using the words knowledge or truth, right? Or reality? Because in that sense, those have just become empty words.
Okay, yeah. Well, my first thought to that, which was just a very practical thought, would be, well, why can't we just use the term like human truths, things that are functional for us, like reducing child mortality rates, reducing women in childbirth, dying through childbirth. They're functional truths, for functional human truths. So why can't we just go with that and dispense with the absurdity of saying reason's out and subjective feelings are out? Like, doesn't build on anything. Do you know what I mean? So
right.
So there seems to be functional human truths that we could kind of all pull together as like, these are functional, okay, but then therefore we're
okay. So what?
Yeah, sorry, you go.
Sorry, yeah. Okay, so what you're doing is a nice move that we call sometimes the pragmatic turn, which is then to say, rather than spending a lot of time trying to figure out ahead of time how our cognitive faculties can come objectively to know reality and then act on the basis of that, what we should do is just take our ideas, whatever they are, act on them, and then see if they work. Right? See if we get these functional results that you like, and then based on evaluating the functional results in a backfeed way, then say that those hypotheses are pretty good or reliable or at least workable. Now, my view is that we can and should do both successfully. I mean, the whole idea of getting reliable knowledge in the first place and trying to be objective is so that when we act in the world, we are more likely to be successful. So I want to integrate the cognitive with the functional. But if you're skeptical about the cognitive, you might, as the pragmatists do, this is pragmatists with a capital P, then say, well, let's forget the cognitive exercises and just focus on the functionality. Now, I'm sympathetic to that, but I don't think that it is going to work fundamentally against the postmodern arguments, because any kind of functional claim is going to be subject to the same sort of skeptical arguments. So you say, for example, that here are the good functional results that you want. You want to have, say, fewer women dying in childbirth. And when we've done these scientific researches, including hygiene and anatomy studies and so forth, those theories, when put into practice, have led to fewer women dying in childbirth. What they will then say is that value judgment, that fewer women dying in childbirth, where did that come from? And they'll say, well, that's just going to be another subjective preference that you are imposing on the world. And you can't say that that's an objective standard, or it should be a universal standard that everyone has to accept. And then any kind of judgment about what's functioning or what's working, you're still trying to make an objective claim. You're trying to say something like, there was this theory and it meant exactly what it meant, and it made certain predictions, and we did these certain things, And if we continue to do those same things, we're going to get the same results. That is to say, cause and effect works in the world.
Sure.
But then you're making universalistic cause and effect science claims, and they're going to say, well, how can you make all of those? They're based on observation, and then you just run through all the skeptical arguments again.
Right. Okay. Well, so I mean, I think I've watched you debate a postmodern professor at some point, and two things. Like, one would be every human, including the postmoderns, would agree that value is a functional value to I guess, go ahead forward and improve our society upon, would be reduce women dying in childbirth. So where do you get that value from? Every single human that doesn't have a psychopathology, you know. So it's intrinsic to our nature that unless you have
notice what so I'm going to play postmodernist here.
Yes, please,
right?
please do, please.
That's right. So I don't think it's true, even if you're not a postmodernist, that everyone agrees that fewer women dying in childbirth is a good thing. There are lots of prominent people, we number them, Mother Teresa and others, even from our own recent generations, who will say pain and suffering is a good thing, and the more pain and suffering we have in the world, the closer we come to God, and so on. And there are others, right, who do not believe genuinely around the world, apparently, that women are worthy objects of moral value. They are second, third, fourth class citizens, right down there with the goats and the sheep and so on. So the first part of your claim is, I don't think it's true. I wish it were true, but I don't think it is true as a social science survey, right, kind of claim. But then the second part of your claim was then to say, you know, everybody except people who are psycho, right, or psychopathological. And then what the postmodern, this is where I'll put my postmodern hat on, even though I don't agree with this argument, is then going to say, oh, so now you're saying there's a distinction between people who have a normal psychology and people who have an abnormal psychology. And that's a value judgment. And you're saying that objectively, some people are in this group and other people are in this group, but I'm just going to pull out all of my skeptical arguments to say, you can't get that sort of objective value distinction off the ground. That's just Christian Jack with his particular way of looking at the world, trying to legislate a certain conception of psychological health onto everyone else. So the same issues about objective categorizations and normalcy as opposed to abnormalcy, all of those value judgments, if you don't have an objective grounding for them, they're going to drive a truck through them.
All right. Yeah, I hear you. I understand that. But I guess the difference would be, yeah, they could have the box of objective value claims and throw that out the window as they want to. But if you just go back to a human functional truth, which doesn't need to claim objectivity and that what they're throwing out, it's a human functional truth, which does extend to, say, all our Western countries and any other person who, again, doesn't have a psychopathology or isn't living in what we now as a progressive kind of human status deem as something barbaric. So everyone, even the postmodern professors who are in our Western societies, would still hold that value and say, yes, that's what we want.
Right. No, I think that's right. That's I think tactically that's a good halfway house to try to defend, right, against a very robust postmodern skepticism.
Okay.
Although I think what you would find is even if you start pushing on those postmodern professors who will say, yes, I accept those values, they would ultimately say, these are just subjective values according to my philosophy that I happen to believe in, or ones that I happen to believe in because I was born in Western society and they were conditioned into me.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. It doesn't hold much water. Like even getting postmodernism through the door for me doesn't get too far. Like its initial claim of there are no universal truths, right?
Yeah.
That is in itself a universal claim.
Well,
so
it is, yes.
So it kind of bites itself in the tail at starting, right? And then hang on.
Yeah, there are lots of issues when you start playing around with skepticism and relativism, how you can even state the position coherently without smuggling in some objectivity.
Okay, so to get over that little hurdle of it, I guess it's
we'll bracket that one to move on.
Yeah, well, it doesn't, they don't really have any compelling to throw those human functional claims out. I think they lump that in with objectivity as a source of eternal truth, which I don't seem to see. It needs to require a connection. But anyhow, like, I guess how they claim the world is to be construed is a field of power struggles between groups. That's their that's another universal claim. That's two claims they're making that's shouldn't be, right? So for starters, like, why is it a battleground of groups? Why not a battleground of individuals? How did it get to the groups? Why not? Why isn't it a power battle of individuals? One by every man for himself, so to speak.
Right. No, you're quite right to say that there's two claims that are being networked there. One is, do we conceive of power as fundamentally malevolent and adversarial, or do we see power as something that can be, of course, adversarial, but also something that can be constructive? So knowledge is power. That was one of the early modern claims from Francis Bacon, and we want to empower people to go out and do things in the world. And we want people to be healthier because healthy bodies are more powerful and so on. So do you have a benevolent understanding of power and say that it's just some people will abuse it and we have to deal with them? Or do you see power as necessarily adversarial, as win-lose, as strong versus weak, right? And so on. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is, well, who or what is the vehicle of power or the user of power? And so the other issue is the individualism or the collectivism. So do you see groups as the unit of reality, that we're all organized into tribal groups or ethnic groups or racial groups or gender groups, or whatever the groups are, and those are the units of contestation or the units of cooperation? Or do you see individuals as the agents, and those individuals can cooperate or contest with each other? So we'd have to really set up a 2x2 matrix, right? So individualism and collectivism versus kind of adversarial versus harmonious, and you'll find people in each category. Now, why the postmoderns have tended to the collectivist interpretations, there's a number of strands here. One of your earlier questions was about Marxism, and so there are some majority strains of postmodernism that are reworkings or evolutions out of Marxist genealogical roots, and Marxism is a highly collectivized understanding of human nature and human dynamics. But there are other strains that the postmoderns have drawn upon that are not necessarily Marxist. So some of them, so if you think of Derrida, for example, who's emphasizing language and seeing everything through a lens of deconstructing the idea that concepts are objective and have fixed meanings, or at least objective meanings, and that networks of concepts carry stable meanings, and that we can objectively interpret literary texts and so on. So all of that is largely coming out of a philosophy of language. And that language has independent roots from any sort of Marxist political philosophical analysis. So one theory of language that has come out of linguistics, and I don't think this is true, or the right interpretation of language, but that says that language is a social product, that it's created by societies, and there are such things as linguistic groups, and that each of us as individuals were born into a linguistic group, and that linguistic group shapes the newborn infant, which is basically like plasticine or very fluid. Mm-hmm. So such that if you took the same baby and put it in a different language group, it would grow up with a different language, right, and so on. But built into that idea of language as a social product is the idea that different languages also bring with them certain assumptions about the way the world works, kind of the built into the syntax sometimes, or certainly built into the semantics, kind of our whole sets of ideological and philosophical assumptions. So when you are a helpless baby, basically this whole philosophy is conditioned into you by the language that you acquire.
Sure.
So what that then means is that, all of you Australians, right, with your take on the English language, you have your linguistically shaped way of looking at the world. I grew up in Canada, and there's some overlap, right? But there's going to be some differences. But then think about people who grew up learning Urdu or Swahili,
Sure.
right? Or some Finnish language with a different syntactical structure. They're then conditioned to look at the world in a very different way. So then the idea is that collective shaping and your collective shaping, as reflected in the languages you speak, you can never really translate across that. So we're all just in our group subjective worlds. So then you are setting yourself up for conflict. When we try to bring these different language groups together, there's no way for them to communicate, but then they get frustrated with each other, and then conflict is going to break out. So there are various vehicles, Marxism, certain understandings of linguistics that lead people to emphasize the collective over the individual.
Okay, I understand. Well, that's a very compelling argument. There's a lot of truths in there with our social influence, how we come about. Just to mention quickly, two other little hypocrisies that stood out with me is that it was, let me see. Okay, so if the world is construed as just a place of power and there are groups competing for power, right? Sorry, did I lose you?
Groups competing for power.
Yeah. So if the world is to be construed as a place of power and there's groups competing for power, and that's all they're capable of doing, these groups are only capable of ascending or acquiring more power. And there is no other ability of that one particular group. That's all they are defined as through the postmodern lens. How is it that the postmoderns are able to be compassionate and want to share across the groups? Because I guess the idea for them is to equalize the power. So how did, and the other part of that would be, how are they exempt from this power craving, and how did they gain the ability to be compassionate and share when their very view is that groups cannot share and they only want power? How do they do this?
Right. Well, I think if you take postmodernism in its strong form, right, as you construe it, there is no way to logically answer those tensions, right? To the extent that you're totally a function of your group and all your group wants is to expand its power at the expense of other groups, then you can't somehow say you can jump outside of your group and be compassionate for another group, right? Or that you can think, jump outside of your group and say, well, my group's values and this group's values should be equally worthy. There is no way to do so. So there is going to be an inconsistency in there at some point. And then I think very quickly, you'd have to get to know the person individually who's making those sorts of claims and ask them. So, if you believe that all groups' ways of looking at things are equally valid, but then at the same time you are saying, I am conditioned to look at the world a certain way because of my group's value framework, how did you come to those two different ideas, and how do you think they can be reconciled? So there is no way to do it, but the way each individual gets there and tries to put them together is going to be different. So you'd have to have an individual discussion.
Very interesting. All right. Okay. No, thanks for that. And okay, another question that I wanted to discuss is, it's a very important question, is, so how does postmodernism manifest in today's Western political beliefs, and how does it operate in our society?
Yeah. Well, that's a huge question. And I think we'll only be able to say a few things in the time available to us.
Sure.
I think one way is that postmodernism is a consistently negative philosophical outlook, right? So it does see itself as a critique, as an undermining, as a subversion, right, of modernism. So most of its efforts are devoted to taking any sort of positive claim about the nature of reality, knowledge, progress, and so on, and tearing it down. So to the extent that we now culturally have a significant number of people who will say there is no truth, there is no beauty, there is no genuine value, everything is a hypocritical mask for nasty power struggles, that is not exclusively, but largely one measure of postmodernism's influence.
Okay.
So the demographic increases in skepticism, cynicism, and kind of nihilism in its extreme forms.
And could you lay out what academic disciplines are maybe infiltrated or predominantly governed by postmodern philosophy in the academic space?
Yeah, that's a fast-moving target. But I would say a generation ago, when I was going through graduate school, philosophy was becoming much healthier. You know, the philosophers had developed all of the skeptical arguments, but they had moved on and were interested in some positive projects, by and large. So at that point, I would say then in the 90s, postmodernism was in the ascendancy in English literature departments, increasingly in history, and it was starting to make some inroads in law. So we saw the rise of critical legal theory and so forth. At the same time, that was the time when there was a large explosion in special studies departments. So we saw the rise of race-based academic departments, or sex/gender women's studies departments, or ethnically study-based study departments. And so what tended to happen was that many of the people who were postmodern friendly went into those departments as well. Also, I would say maybe around the change of the millennium, we started to see a concerted move in education schools, where kind of postmodern ideologies were trying to say what we now need to do is not only teach the next generation of students the proper way to think, but first we have to retrain the teachers who are going to teach the right generation or the next generation of students. So that's a quick answer, but what I would also say is that we don't really have very good surveyed results that would give us the demographics. So a lot of this has to be anecdotal.
Okay, all right. And just to finish painting this little picture, to get my own mind, onto this. So those disciplines you mentioned usually are, like, from what I can tell, and I guess it's quite obvious online information you can come across, are like they're the bedrock or the foundation for many activist groups that we see in today's society. Like I've heard a lot about Black Lives Matter and Ibram X. Kendi's book of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and all of intersectionality, intersectional feminism, whatever it may be, gender ideology. What I guess would like to draw the dots there, connect the dots there, is like those types of specific types of activism, those groups would be like they are born from like postmodern thinking. That's where it's coming from, these groups, the way they look at the world. Would that be a fair way to connect dots to them?
Yeah. If you thought,
sorry.
Well, again, I think that would be a fascinating survey demographic study to take your top 1,000 activists who are out there right now, and then look at what they majored in university, and start to see if there are patterns there. And that would be a fascinating study.
Well, like, I mean, yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I guess a lot of you see a lot of posts on Instagram, all the activist types, anyone that's generally compassionate sharing type activist posts, and it's all has the same tropes of deconstructionism, skepticism, cynicism, subjectivism, and relativism, about tearing down what we have, dismantling what we have. And they all seem to be of the same school of thought of postmodernism. That seems to be where it comes from.
Yeah, well, this I think then picks up on the kind of a second part of the question prior to that we transitioned into in this one, is that another way postmodernism is manifesting itself, I think, is a little more indirect, in a way of setting the stage. Because on the one hand, postmoderns want to say there are no values that are objective and universal, but at the same time, many of the activists whom you are citing are making kind of objectivist, universalistic value claims. They are saying things like, Black lives really matter, all of them, universally, and you are wrong if you disagree with me about this. And that then is to not to talk like a postmodern, but to talk like a modernist. Right? It says there are universal objective values that I believe in. At the same time, I think there is a genealogical connection that they're not, when you push them, going to give you officially modernist answers for that I've got an objective theory of values and I've got rational arguments, right, and so forth. It's much more adversarial and emotionalist and physicalist in its intimidation tactics in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the way the connection to postmodernism is a little bit then stage setting. What postmodernism does is takes people down a skeptical road and down a road to where they believe that there is no such thing as objective truth, and there are no real universal values. And so the person gets to a point where they are feeling somewhat emptied and despairing and feeling like ultimately it looks like I'm looking into the void of nihilism here. And to the extent that people are well read in the postmodern theorists, they will go down that road. But then I think human psychology kicks in, because however much they talk themselves out of there being such a thing as human nature and human identity in a real world, they still are human beings. They have values, they have goals. They want their lives to be meaningful. They want to be engaged in great battles for justice and to make a difference in the world. So their natural, real humanity comes out and it manifests itself psychologically. And so what then I think happens, though, is that they just reach the conclusion that, well, I don't think that philosophy or psychology or any sort of claimed scientific objective discipline is going to help me live a meaningful life. It's all empty, but I want to have a meaningful life. And so what I need to do is make this subjective activist commitment into the things that I find myself happening to believe. And if I happen to have been raised in a society where I think racial differences or racism is inappropriate, there's a certain amount of sexism, and all of that's unjust, and I've come to believe that that's true, then that's where I'm going to make my leap. I'll just take it as a subjective leap into that framework, and I will become an activist of a certain sort.
Right. Okay. And then just to connect this little, draw this picture clearer for myself. Yeah. These gentlemen you spoke about before, who are maybe deemed as the forefathers of postmodernism, Michel Foucault, sure, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and Richard Rorty. I've been trying to practice to say his name, but Richard Rorty.
Nicely done.
Thank you. And but they're all very far left politically leaning. So they're all coming from some form or manifestation of socialism or Marxism, whether it's Maoist or Trotskyite, yes, or whichever way. So is that the actual objective part of the postmoderns claim, where they're actually trying to equalize the power between the power groups? So not only is it there's a struggle of power between groups, the objective claim or the moral Marxist claim would be to equalize the power between the groups. Yeah.
Yeah, and that ties into a point you were making about 10 minutes ago, that despite the postmodern epistemological claims, right, that there is no truth, there is no knowledge, there's no universal values, right, and so forth, that equality does seem to be exempted from that, right, that in some sense, I still need to believe that equality is good. So if I'm going to say oppressor versus oppressed, and it's bad that there are people who are unequal and weaker and being oppressed, well, I'm making a kind of universalistic claim.
Sure.
And if I want to bring down the oppressors and raise up the oppressed, then again, I'm using equality as a kind of universal normative claim. Now, when you point this out to them explicitly, again, I think you're going to get very individualized responses. Some of them will say, well, I'm not actually saying that because my official philosophy doesn't let me say that. But in practice, then they are saying that and they are acting that particular way. So there's a kind of hypocrisy, even if it's not a fully conscious hypocrisy, or there's
Sure. Yeah.
a breach between theory and practice there.
Okay.
But then there are some, like Derrida, Jacques Derrida, toward the end of his life, as deconstructionist as he was, he would in interviews say things like, I can't let go of, and I'm putting words in his mouth and paraphrasing here, I can't let go of equality as some sort of regulative ideal. And now the regulative ideal is a semi-technical term of art here, the way Kant or Immanuel Kant spoke of regulative ideals as some sort of, we're not necessarily sure that they are real, but they're necessary for us to think the way we need to think about the world. So he can't let it go. So the answer is yes, but I think we also have to talk across generations, because it is important that those first generation postmoderns were coming of age in the 60s and 1970s, and we're now pushing 40 or 50 years later, and they've been dead right now for a generation, almost all of them. So the question then is, even if the movement postmodern came into existence by leading intellectuals, all of whom were very far left, various forms of Marxism or something close to it, it doesn't necessarily mean that 2 generations later, Marxism is still driving the ship, right? And I think that is what has happened. There still is a kind of generic leftism about it, right? Seeing things as strong versus weak, everything is deeply adversarial, that there's this veiled cover story and we need to rip the masks off and show the ugliness and the hypocrisy underneath. All of that, I think, is carried over, but it's not classical Marxism anymore. It's evolved and morphed in various directions.
Very interesting. Well, from what I can tell, and please comment on this, the value claim of Marxism would be the intolerance of corruption and all the back scratching at the top to evade paying taxes or whatever they do up there, which is corrupt and unfair. The value claim of Marxism is very much a human. I think it's within all of us, to a degree, whether you're a free capitalist person, you still don't want to see an unfair game being played up the top, and you want to stop that unfair game rigging going on. So it's Marxism as a philosophical package. You could almost extract out that value claim, and that's within all of us. Like, I mean, anyone would love to see underprivileged or marginalized groups thrive more than they are currently. That's like a big deal, which everybody needs to
that's been the entire thrust of the modernist project for 500 years, right? To say, there is a great deal of oppression and abuses of power, and this hierarchical structure of society, politically and economically and religiously, and men up here and women down here, that there was a huge amount of inappropriate hierarchical structure of society, and we want to get rid of all of the corruptions and all of those hierarchies down to the level of each individual, make each individual free to find their own way in the world. So I think in many cases, young people who are attracted to postmodernism, they're attracted by the rhetoric of it, that it's co-opting that traditional language of some things are unfair, and there should be certain forms of equality that we have not yet reached. But then I think it gets packaged with a very corrupt philosophical framework, the postmodern one, instead of the healthier modernist one.
Okay, so it seems like this postmodern cynicism or skepticism has powerful enough to shine a light on all the evils that manifest in our societies, Western societies. But it always does seem to be, like, I keep my finger on the pulse of a lot of political ongoings in your country, North America, UK. We're a little behind you guys in Australia here, but what's going on here, etc. You find out what's happening, right? And it does always seem to point to like in one hand, you have this tool to destroy and dismantle, which is the postmodern tool. On the other hand would be the value claim of distributing that power equally amongst the groups. That's that spirit of Marxism, whether it's a total unique or a specific package of Marxism or not, it's irrelevant. It's the function of it. So it's like, I just seem to get, and the other question I wanted to get to here would be like, would the ultimate goal of this postmodern dismantling tool just be, after you've destroyed everything, you need to replace it with something which seems to be socialism? So is that where all roads lead at the end of this postmodern? If it was to play out for the next, say, 20 years, is it socialism that is the savior to, I guess, control the naughty power groups? To put it
Yeah. I don't think you can generalize about the end game, right, of postmoderns. I think there are subgroups with different end games in mind. So I think by analogy, if you think of religious people, they might all say nominally be Christian, but there are some Christians for whom the important thing is to get everybody into heaven. And that's one legitimate type of Christianity. But there's other Christians for whom the end game seems to be making sure that lots of people are burning in hell. And that's the end game that they're very interested in. And others, Christianity is just about softening the rough edges of this world so that we can all live a pretty nice life. So there are different strains of Christianity, and I think the same thing is true rather of postmoderns. I think there are postmoderns who will take all of the negative arguments and push them all of the way and reach a kind of nihilism. That they think there is, in fact, nothing of value, including any socialistic views that they have. That socialism also is not going to be able to withstand the dissolving acid of postmodern ideology. So I think that's one. And that's a nihilistic postmodernism. I think others, though, are strategic in the sense that they will say socialism has been a big loser for the last 2 centuries in the modern world. Every socialist experiment has failed, and capitalism or some sort of market liberalism seems to be ascendancy, however compromised, right, and so forth. And I don't think that I can make a good, rational, objective case for socialism given that history. But what postmodernism allows me to do is use all of these negative tools, as you were describing, against whatever the current system is, and to deconstruct it, to break it down, to subvert it, so that then it's going to become a kind of free-for-all, an intellectual free-for-all, a cultural free-for-all, and we might even take it to the streets, to the fact that we're fighting in the streets. But in that free-for-all, my group then has a fighting chance of grabbing power and then putting its agenda in place. And that might be some kind of socialism.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting. It's funny, but like all of the, not all, but like a lot of what I see in the disciplines you told me about just before that are maybe influenced heavily by postmodern thinking, in these like course descriptions, the word Marxism and Marxist comes up. Like a lot of these seems to be, a lot of the professors identify as Marxism. Like even in the activist groups, there's a lot of Marxist ideas through them, and even like there's nothing hidden about it. So I haven't, like, whether there's other little offshoots of ideas of like a third type of scenario that could come up, or like anarchy where everyone just has a go in their little group setting. But it seems to me that the over dominant solution after dismantling, the over-dominant idea is the Marxist socialism idea, and I haven't seen a competing
absolutely.
idea.
And I think that's certainly a strategic, even by professors who are postmodern. And when you talk to them as sophisticated intellectuals with their PhDs, they will say, "Oh yeah, Marxism has got all kinds of problems with it, and makes all these metaphysical assumptions and blah blah blah." But nonetheless, if your goal is not so much an intellectual goal, but an activist training goal, that's what you want to do as a professor. Marxism is a very good kind of kindergarten level philosophy to train activists, right? Because it's a very simple story for undergraduates to wrap their minds around, and it's very easy to get them fired up and angry, right, about that. And so once they are in that state, then they're going to hate modernity, they're going to hate capitalism, They're going to hate the society that they are created in. And that's something that you can then work with. Whether they believe the 20 theses of Marxism literally, that's not the important point.
Okay. And just another little point. I wanted to, this is an interesting question. It seems like it makes sense to me, but I would love to know your thoughts. Is collectivism, is that just basically, if you hold a collectivist viewpoint, is that the genesis for sexism, racism, and a discrimination towards a group? Is that where
Well,
where that kind of evil mode of being, is that where they come from? Just having a collectivist view? And if not, like,
well, I think in terms of the taxonomy, right, traditional sexism and racism and ethnocentrism are all species of collectivism, because all of them, racists don't see people as individuals. They first see you as a member of a group.
exactly.
Sexists don't see females as individuals with their own minds and values. They see them first and foremost as a member of a group.
Sure.
So one of the important theses of individualism is that we are first and foremost unique individuals, and then secondarily we can be put into various kinds of groups. But the group memberships are always subordinate to our individual identities. But I think that the way you were putting the question, I think is a little more nuanced, and so I think it would depend on the individual again that you are dealing with. I think some of them, people buy into a kind of collectivism in general, and that then comes to be the lens through which they just process everybody that they meet in the world. But I think for other people, they're much more piecemeal about it. They might be individualistic with respect to members of their family, and they can recognize that, suppose I'm a male, there's lots of smart women in my family and forceful women in my family, as well as weak ones. And there are wimpy guys in my family and stupid guys in my family, as well as smart guys in my family. So across gender and sex lines, I'm functioning as an individualist. But then you start saying, well, those Australians right over there, and I've never really actually met Australians, but I hear some stereotypes about Australians. Then I have a collectivized understanding of what Australians are. And so on ethnicity, I'm a collectivist instead of being an individualist.
Okay. Well, I guess you
So
can
again, it
hold,
becomes individual very quickly.
yeah, well, I guess you can hold two views at once simultaneously,
That's right. That's right.
having individuals you value across all sorts of groups in your personal space. But then what I mean
Yes.
by, yeah, but then I also think that still coexists with the idea that if you do have a sexist tendency or a racist tendency, its foundation is the collectivist view of that said sex or how you treat those people.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. It has to be.
yeah, exactly. By
Yeah.
definition, it seems, right? All right. So then, in having said that, there's another question I want to ask you about, which is about the I guess individuality, really, and individualism. So how is
Hmm.
unequal individuality good, and what has it achieved? It's like, say, since we've entrusted the individual with the
Ah.
capacity for reason, what has like individuality done good?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because we've been focusing a lot on the negative, so it'd be nice to emphasize the positive
My
for
apologies.
a little bit here. No, no, that's fine. It's important material. But I have two thoughts about that. One is, if each of us individually thinks about our own life, what most fulfills us, and the moments that we have experienced the most happiness, the most fulfillment, the most sense of being in the zone. And it's always when we have uh, done our own individual thing. Right? So if you think about the pleasures of listening to music and choosing your music, that your ability to freely explore all the kinds of music that is out there and then make your own choice and say, that really fits with me, without having to say, I like this music because all of my friends like this music, or I like this music because it's something that my parents make me listen to, right, and so forth. I chose it. If you think about your friendships that have been meaningful to you, your romances, I mean, your love and sex life is only going to be fulfilling to the extent that you say, I really like this person, and when I interact with this person, it's great, as opposed to we all know the horror stories. Your parents choose your mate for you. I mean, that's not going to be very fulfilling. So your food preferences, your clothing styles, your musical preference, your friendships, your career, right? If you want to have a meaningful career, the idea that you have to choose it for yourself and invest in it yourself and acquire your own skill set and knowledge set, and you make it work. That's the only thing that has made careers meaningful to people. And we know by experience that anytime we are doing a job because it's assigned to us by mom and dad, or I have to do work, or just society has certain expectations, then I feel dehumanized and unfulfilled in the work. So I would urge people to think through in their own individual lives the things that have been genuinely fulfilling and meaning making for them, and you'll find it's the individual there. Now, if we then scale out and we say all of the great cultural achievers, so we think of the giants in science, Galileo, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, or the giants in art, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Shakespeare, and so forth. And if we want to say, those people have enriched my life, or they've enriched the lives of millions, if not billions of people over the years, and that's great. What made it possible for those people to accomplish so much? The story is always the same, right? Isaac Newton loved math and physics, and he poured himself into it, and he had the social space to be able to do so. Michelangelo, he had to fight for it a little bit more, but his individuality was encouraged, and he was able to do what it was. Beethoven, again, had to fight for it, but he had that strong individual personality, individual voice, and he was able to prevail. So almost every single story that I can think of someone who has been a major accomplisher, it's always been because of they're having the individuality and the social space within which they can cultivate their individuality.
Right. Yeah, I guess in the case I hear is like, there's a lot of things wrong with our society right now. Obviously, there needs to be, what in my opinion, radical changes. Where it feels like we've become so intelligent so quickly, and now we have this technology to share information. There are radical changes we could make to improve society even further. Like we almost can see it, and we're fighting over how to get there. But then the other story to that is, but we've gone so far from all of these individual achievements that individuals have given us or gifted us to enrich our lives every single way. So there's almost like a huge gratitude you can have for like all the work that's gone on before, if you're in a lucky, privileged place, I guess. So I guess
even if you are in an unlucky and unprivileged place, right, using those terms, I would still say the exact same thing. Wherever you are, however bad it is, you have to be your own person, and you have to figure out for yourself what's going to be meaningful in your life, and then fight like hell for it. And at the same time, you should, though, this is where the optimism will come in, recognize that there are huge numbers of people all around the world who are on your side. And if you're suffering from sexist discrimination or political oppression or religious oppression, we're there for you to the extent that we know about you and want to. So it should be benevolent. And then also your point about gratitude, I think, is a good one. We can at the same time recognize, there are problems and we still have work to do, but not overgeneralize that to the point of not recognizing the amazing strides that we have made just in the last couple of centuries.
Yeah, I guess the tricky part is like some people have an easier time feeling that sense of gratitude, being in their place free from drama, wherever they are, and then some people have a easier time feeling the pessimistic side of where things are. But I think ultimately it's a combination of both that you need to have in whatever place you are, but it's definitely not one or the other, So That's where I see there's
Yeah.
an understanding that people have a different percentage mix of that gratitude or optimism, but it's definitely wrong to
Yeah.
be only grateful and not think that there's anything to change, or only pessimistic and not be grateful for anything. I think it's just the recipe for
Yeah.
disaster right
Nicely
there.
said. Nicely said.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay. If I could still steal a bit more of your time, do you have a bit more time?
A couple more minutes, but I do need to make a transition. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
let's do one more question though, okay?
Okay. So how about we go for like, I'm a bit of a free thinking, free spirit, romantic. I'm an adventurous one. I've done lots of travel, and I think very optimistically through the world,
Great.
of the world. That's my personal view. I've had my
All
fair
right.
share of dramas. I know pain. You trust me on that. But I am a romantic at heart, and I see the good and beauty. I wish to, explore further, and I wish more people to, right? So the question here would be, how can we arm young people with optimistic, romantic, and sophisticated views and tools to take on the world and bring about good and improve it?
Yeah. Well, that's a hard question. So if you think about, I think you have to go back to childhood. That's where our not only our physical health but our psychological health is formed. And obviously, you can repair things and improve things in adulthood, but the physical and psychological foundation that's set in childhood is important. So a lot of these things are cliches, but they are absolutely true cliches. So parents setting a good example, and the parents themselves being interesting people who are decent people who are living their lives and so forth, and treating each other benevolently and lovingly and progressively and so on. And children watch a lot and they learn a huge amount from their parents. So I would say, yeah, be a good parent. But then all of the other things, childhood stories, all of the stories about, and and the moral of the story is, well, what is the moral of the story? Is it that, yes, life can be hard and difficult, but with creativity and perseverance, we can reach a good resolution, on a scale of a story for a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 12-year-old. So it gets built up. The idea that you can rise to the challenges. So that optimistic sense that things can be worked out. And then I think the other thing is just actually developing the powers that children need, their cognitive powers. They can observe the world. They can figure out the way things work, and their skills that they can take things apart and put them back together. They know how things work, and they like to play around with things and so on. So building up their knowledge base, building up their skill set, having very good examples of benevolent, romantic adults in their lives. And I think on the basis of that, then they become cognitively powerful, and they have the genuine self-esteem that lets them then take on the world when they go off.
Yeah, right, sure. So I mean, as you said, knowledge is power, and empowering young ones with their capacity to use their logic and reason
Yeah,
is what will allow them to operate in the world and bring good as they see fit, or chase the adventures as they see fit.
yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, well, I'm happy to hear you say this, because I mean, there's a lot of this attack on reason in current political news, and yeah, it's
Well, that's right. That's why, and to cycle back to postmodernism and its various offshoots in this generation, right? If to young people, right, your message is you don't know anything, you will never know anything, nobody knows anything, everyone is just an irrational, grasping animal, and everyone's at each other's throats, and no matter what you do, the forces that be are going to try to keep you down. Well, that's just going to scare the hell out of little kids, and it's going to lead them to retreat into their shell. And at the same time, you're not developing them the knowledge or the skills. So I think that's a profoundly misguided, but I think in many cases actually evil
mm,
approach to education. These are people who should know better.
yes, the what is it? A Nietzschean word of maybe it was his word, but obscurantism comes to mind. The darkening of
Well,
one's
yes,
world view and existence
yeah,
itself seems to be what's prevalent. And
right, yeah. Well, I think that's one of the rhetorical signs of that you're dealing with a dishonest person is any sort of obscurantism. Or an honest person wants to make things clear.
Yeah.
An obscurantism person wants the appearance, and they know what they're doing.
Right. Well,
All right,
look,
sir. A pleasure talking with you. Really good questions. And it sounds like you're on a great journey. So enjoy it.
yeah, Dr. Hicks, thank you so much for your time, and appreciate your attention in the conversation.
Yeah, a real pleasure.
All
All
right.
right, Christian. Bye for now.
Take care.